The goal of Religion Soup is to create a forum where issues pertaining to the Christian faith can be discussed in an intellectually stimulating manner. It is our hope that Religion Soup will spawn many conversations about questions that should be talked about and are often ignored. Tonight, we are lucky to have two of the world's eminent New Testament historians amongst us, namely Dr. Bart Ehrman and Dr. Craig Evans. Does the New Testament present a reliable portrait of the historical Jesus? Approximately 2 billion people in the world identify themselves as Christians. For Christians, Jesus is thought of as being the very Son of God. For Muslims, Jesus, or Isa, is revered as a great prophet. Many Jews see a loyal example in Jesus, or his name in Aramaic or Hebrew, Yeshua, as a model Israelite who made a positive impact on this world by his life and teachings. However, what can we know about Jesus of Nazareth historically? Is the New Testament a reliable source for discovering historical material about him? Or should we be more cautious about what we can know about Jesus? Tonight, this question will be answered by two of the leading lights in historical Jesus research. I will introduce each presenter before they come to the stage to give their answer to the evening's question. I will begin with Dr. Evans. Craig Evans is the Payzant Distinguished Professor of New Testament at Acadia Divinity College of Acadia University in Wolfville, Nova Scotia. He is a graduate of Claremont McKenna College. He received his Master of Divinity from Western Baptist Seminary in Portland, Oregon, and his Master of Arts and Ph.D. in Biblical Studies from Claremont Graduate University in Southern California. He's also been awarded the Doctor of Habilitation by the Karoli Gaspard Reformed University in Budapest. A well-known evangelical scholar throughout the world, he's an elected member of the prestigious SNTS, a society dedicated to New Testament studies. After teaching 1 year at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, Professor Evans taught at Trinity Western University in British Columbia for 21 years, where he directed the graduate program in biblical studies and founded the Dead Sea Scrolls Institute. He was also a visiting fellow at Princeton Theological Seminary in Princeton, New Jersey. He's the author and editor of more than 60 books and hundreds of articles and reviews, including the highly acclaimed Fabricating Jesus, How Modern Scholars Distort the Gospels, as well as Jesus, The Final Days, co-authored with N.T. Wright, and the upcoming book, Jesus and His World, The Archaeological Evidence. Professor Evans has given lectures at Cambridge, Oxford, Durham, Yale, and other universities, colleges, seminaries, museums, such as the Field Museum in Chicago, the Canadian Museum of Civilization in Ottawa, and the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. He also regularly lectures and gives talks at popular conferences and retreats on the historical Jesus, archaeology, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Bible. Along with countless interviews on radio networks across Canada and the US, Dr. Evans has been seen on Dateline NBC, CBC, CTV, Day of Discovery, and many documentaries aired on BBC, the Discovery Channel, History Channel, History Television, and others. He also has served as a consultant for the National Geographic Society. Dr. Evans is married to his wife Ginny, is the father of 2 grown children, Carrie and Jill, and has a grandson, Merrick, who brings him great joy. We are very fortunate to have a scholar with the pedigree of Professor Evans teaching in our very own province in Nova Scotia at Acadia. So, Dr. Evans, does the New Testament present a reliable portrait of the historical Jesus? Ladies and gentlemen, will you join with me as we welcome Dr. Evans to the podium?
Thank you very much, Greg, and thank you also, Kevin, for your greeting. And let me also thank Professor Ehrman for flying up, which is not always the best thing to do in the middle of January. I thank you for that, and it's always good to see you again. Welcome to Nova Scotia. Does the New Testament present a reliable portrait of the historical Jesus? In short, yes, it does. But let me explain what I will be referring to primarily, and that's the four Gospels of the New Testament. Now, I believe there is information that's useful and helpful found in the other 23 books of the New Testament. We have some of Jesus' sayings alluded to, one or two events alluded to or described in Paul's letters. But our primary source, when we ask the question about the New Testament, our primary source is, of course, the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I should say something else about those four Gospels. We call the first three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic Gospels, from a compound Greek word that means seen together. They're very similar, they overlap, they cover a lot of the same ground, and in fact they are literarily related to one another. John is very different. Although some scholars think John might have a literary connection to one or more of the synoptics, I do not think so. So I see John as independent. My remarks will mostly focus on Matthew, Mark, and Luke because I believe that they are, in fact, a type of historiography, that is the writing of history. They are a type of biography. The Gospel of John is far more complicated than that, highly metaphorical. That is not to say there is no history in John, it's just that it's a much more complicated interpretive and theological writing. So yes, I do believe that the New Testament, particularly with reference to the four Gospels, I believe the New Testament presents a reliable portrait of the historical Jesus. Of course, the New Testament has a lot more to say than that, and the New Testament is not preoccupied simply with spelling out a biography of Jesus. I'm not alone. A lot of scholars think so. In the last century, hundreds of learned books have appeared, authored by scholars who serve or served on the faculties of the finest universities in North America, the United Kingdom, continental Europe, and elsewhere. In more recent years, one thinks of the late Ben Meyer's The Aims of Jesus, in which he believes the four New Testament Gospels provide us with a coherent, plausible portrait of the historical Jesus. Ben taught for many years at McMaster University, and as was mentioned in the introduction, that's where I actually began my academic career and became a good friend of Ben. One of Ben's colleagues at McMaster was E.P. Sanders. Sanders taught at McMaster from 1966 to 1984. From 1984 to 1990, he was Dean Ireland's Professor of Holy Scripture at Oxford University. Sanders moved to Duke University in North Carolina in 1990, where he retired in 2005. In the introduction to his critically acclaimed Jesus and Judaism, published in 1985, Sanders remarks, quote, "The dominant view today seems to be that we can know pretty well what Jesus was out to accomplish, that we can know a lot about what he said, and that these two things make sense within the world of first century Judaism," end of quote. Note what Sanders said, the dominant view today, not the view of some or the view of a few naive fundamentalists, but he said the dominant view in reference to major scholars. And is this optimistic view of the Gospels, that from them we can know pretty well what Jesus set out to accomplish, that we can know a lot about what he said, still the dominant view? I must ask this question because, after all, Sanders penned those words more than 25 years ago. Well, judging by the ongoing flood of publications by competent, trained, credentialed scholars in the finest academic institutions around the world, it still seems to be the dominant view. One thinks of John Meyer's multi-volumed work entitled A Marginal Jew. The first volume appeared in 1991, in which Meyer, professor of New Testament at Notre Dame University, expressed his conviction that a, quote, reasonably complete biographical portrait of the historical Jesus can be had through a careful examination of the gospel material in the light of the criteria of historicity. 3 more hefty volumes have since appeared since 1991, the most recent, I believe, 2007, bringing the page count of Meyer's work thus far to just under 3,000 pages. And we, in fact, await the 5th and final volume. I should also mention James Dunn's 1,000-page tome, Jesus Remembered, which appeared in 2003. Dunn, longtime professor of New Testament at the University of Durham, believes that the teachings and activities of the historical Jesus were embedded in the collective memory of the early Christian community and eventually committed to writing in the Gospels. I might also mention Ehrman Tarek's Jesus, a Biography, which was published just last year. Tarek is Dean and Professor of New Testament on the Faculty of Theology of the University of Catalonia in Barcelona. He is also President of the Society of New Testament Studies, an elite international society of New Testament scholars whose membership is by vetting and invitation only. Tarek has the highest regard for the historical accuracy of the Gospels. Are all of these scholars wrong? Have they wasted their time? Is there a body of scholarly work by equally competent university professors that has refuted their conclusions, exposed as baseless their working assumptions? No. I've mentioned a number of scholars who come from different perspectives. John Meyer is a moderate Roman Catholic, so also was the late Ben Meyer. Ed Sanders is a liberal Protestant. James Dunn is a moderate Protestant. If I had time, I could name a number of Jewish scholars, like Geza Vermesh, who for many years was professor of Judaism at Oxford University, who believed the New Testament Gospels provide historians with reliable information about Jesus of Nazareth. Why do these scholars think this way? These scholars believe that the New Testament Gospels are reliable for at least 2 important reasons. First, the Greek text of the 4 Gospels, indeed the text of all 27 writings that make up the New Testament, is stable and in all probability is quite close to the original text. No one claims that we have recovered the autographic text, the originals, but most New Testament scholars and textual critics think that through comparison and careful study, we have reconstructed the text within, give it a percentage you want, 98, 99, more or less, % of its original form. We have the complete text of the 4 New Testament Gospels preserved in documents about 270 to 280 years removed from the autographs. We have substantial portions of the text removed by about 130 to 200 years. We have tiny portions of the text and perhaps as many as 1 dozen documents about 70 to 120 years removed from the autographs. All in all, not a bad record. Compared to many of the classical writings and histories where in most cases there are gaps of 800 to 1,000 years or more between the time of the author of the original and our oldest surviving copy of his manuscript, it is an excellent record indeed. Second, New Testament scholars, historians, and archaeologists view the Gospels as essentially reliable because they exhibit verisimilitude, a Latin word that means they resemble the way things really were. That is, the contents of these writings match with what we know of the place, people, and period described in the document. Their contents cohere with what is known through other written sources and through archaeological finds. Their contents give evidence of acquaintance with the topography and geography of the region that forms the backdrop to the story. The authors of these documents exhibit knowledge of the culture and customs of the people they describe. Ancient narratives that possess these characteristics are used by historians and archaeologists. The New Testament Gospels and Acts exhibit a great deal of verisimilitude. They speak of real people: Pontius Pilate, Herod Antipas, Annas, Caiaphas, Herod Agrippa I, Herod Agrippa II, Felix, Festus, and they speak of real events, the death of John the Baptist, the death of Agrippa I. They speak of real places, villages, cities, roads, lakes, mountains, which are clarified and corroborated by other historical sources and by archaeology. They speak of real customs, Passover, purity, Sabbath, divorce law, institutions, synagogue, temple, offices and officers, priests, tax collectors, Roman governors, Roman centurions. They speak of religious and philosophical beliefs that we know existed back then, the beliefs of Pharisees and Sadducees, interpretation of Scripture, and the like. In contrast to the verisimilitude of the New Testament Gospels and the book of Acts, and I mentioned the book of Acts here, it's the second volume of Luke, Acts. I mention it only because it describes events in Palestine, not because, it's yet another source about Jesus. In contrast to the verisimilitude of the Gospels and Acts stand the Gospels and gospel-like writings of the 2nd century, such as the Gnostic Gospels and Syria's Gospel of Thomas. These writings do not exhibit verisimilitude, at least not verisimilitude with early 1st century Jewish Palestine. On the basis of Thomas alone, would we know that Jesus was Jewish? Would we have any sense of his message? Any sense of his travels, of his itinerary? Would we know anything of Jesus' death? Would we have any sense of life in 1st century Jewish Palestine? We would not. The verisimilitude of the New Testament Gospels and Acts is such that historians and archaeologists regularly make use of them. The New Testament Gospels and Acts assist archaeologists in decisions where to dig and understanding what they find when they dig it up. None of this can be said with respect to the Gospel of Thomas and the other extra-canonical Gospels. I can illustrate this claim by directing readers to a recently published book entitled Jesus and Archaeology. But let me illustrate what I'm saying about verisimilitude in archaeology. It's a very important criterion, and historians are much guided by it. Doesn't mean they conclude that something is inerrant or infallible or mistake-free. It just means they now take it seriously. So I refer to a book entitled Jesus and Archaeology, a book that was edited by Jim Charlesworth and published in 2006. The book grew out of a conference in Israel which included the usual learned papers, but also included on-site visits and examinations of archaeological excavations. The volume includes 31 essays. 1/3 of the contributors are Jewish, and about 1/3 are trained archaeologists. The remainder are historians and biblical scholars. If you turn to the index of sources that are cited, at the back of the book, you will find more than 1,000 references to the New Testament Gospels and Acts. There are very, very few references to the 2nd century apocryphal Gospels, the Gnostic Gospels, and the Gospel of Thomas. If the New Testament Gospels and Acts were little better than the 2nd century extra-canonical writings, then their extensive use by historians and archaeologists would be very difficult to explain. Indeed, one would wonder why a book on the subject, Jesus and Archaeology, could even be produced if there really wasn't much connection between the Gospels, which tell us our primary source about Jesus, and the reality, the realia, and the material culture which archaeologists uncover. Of course, this book is not alone. Many other books on archaeology that are concerned with Israel in the approximate time of Jesus made extensive use of New Testament Gospels and Acts. Some of these recent contributions are by Eric Myers of Duke University, Shimon Gibson of the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Both of these archaeologists are Jewish. Gibson's book focuses on the final days of Jesus. He cites the New Testament Gospels hundreds of times, showing again and again the coherence between them and the archaeological record. Jody Magnus, another Jewish archaeologist and a member of the faculty of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, recently published an essay on the topic of the tomb of Jesus. Throughout her essay, she compared what the New Testament Gospels say and what archaeologists and historians have learned. Along the way, she challenges and contradicts some skeptics. At the end of her study, she remarks, and I quote, "I believe that the gospel accounts of Jesus' burial are largely consistent with the archaeological evidence." Historians and archaeologists rightly regard the New Testament Gospels as early and generally reliable. I'm not saying that these scholars necessarily view the New Testament writings as inerrant or inspired, but many of these scholars do see them as valuable sources, without which historical and archaeological work concerned with first century Jewish Palestine would be much more difficult. No archaeologist or historian would say this with regard to the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas, or most other second century writings, which some New Testament scholars and popular writers have in recent years lionized. If it is acknowledged that the New Testament Gospels contain useful historical data, it must also be acknowledged that they also contain a number of disagreements and discrepancies when we compare them to one another. Why do they? Do discrepancies discredit the Gospels? How are these discrepancies to be understood? To these questions we now turn. Any careful, fair reading of the Gospels side by side will reveal a number of differences and discrepancies. Some of these discrepancies are more apparent than real, but many of them are real indeed. We observe differences in the wording of Jesus' teaching, sayings clustered together in one gospel, for example, in one of the discourses in Matthew, are scattered over several chapters in another gospel, as seen, for example, in the central section of Luke. The order and sequence of a number of episodes sometimes vary from gospel to gospel. Details and parallel stories sometimes vary, and on it goes. Most scholars are not troubled by such discrepancies, recognizing a number of factors involved, such as the diversity of the material and the selecting and editing work of the respective evangelists. What many readers of the Gospels may not know is that the discrepancies in the Gospels began with Jesus himself. Jesus' teaching was not static and unchanging. It was adaptable. It was situational. It was applied to a variety of settings, and it was altered as the occasion required. He taught his disciples accordingly. Yes, they were to learn his teaching, to memorize his words, but they were expected to apply them according to the needs of evangelism and teaching. These disciples or learners, and the Greek word is mathetai, meaning learners, could hardly claim to be genuine disciples if their learning never progressed beyond rote memory and mere repetition. How do we know this? I mean, I assert this. How do I know what I'm talking about? We know it because this was the understanding of education and pedagogy in late antiquity. I say this about the Gospels because we do have at hand a lot of important information about pedagogy, that is how people were taught, but more importantly, listen up, about the way a master teacher's teaching was appropriated by his disciples. I mean, most modern day professors wished that our students had that kind of commitment. And so the teaching was memorized, but then it was understood and could be adapted and applied. It could be expanded, it could be contracted, the wording could be altered, it could be made to fit new circumstances, it could be linked in chains together and create a discourse. This was not just allowed, it was expected. That's the way it was taught. We need to understand that, and so Jesus taught his disciples as other teachers taught their disciples, and so we see the same phenomena in the literature roughly contemporaneous with him. Rabbinic literature and Hellenistic literature. Now you might wonder, now wait a minute, Hellenistic Greek literature is one thing, but you might think these are two different worlds. The Hellenistic, the Greek world, and the Jewish world. But Jewish scholars have shown that the Jewish world of Jesus' day, actually 100 years earlier, had been heavily influenced by Greek pedagogy, Greek instruction. In fact, that was controversial and was part of the reason why in the 2nd century BC there was the Maccabean revolt. There was just a little too much Greek in the minds of some conservative Jews. And we can show that the actual principles of biblical interpretation practiced by the early rabbis grew right out of the principles of interpretation practiced by the Greeks. Now, what makes this so useful is we actually have the handbooks, the Greek handbooks, on how to study, how to teach, how to learn. And this leads me then to the next point. New Testament scholars have discovered the kreia, the useful anecdote. The kreia, it's a Greek word, it just basically means useful, something that's useful. It's useful for instruction, a saying, a deed, and these are talked about in several handbooks from antiquity. We see this in that very form in the Gospels. In fact, that may be how we understand Papias in his reference to the Gospel of Mark, where he talks about how Mark did not write things in order, but wrote kreia. Now, I realize there is some dispute over exactly how that should be understood, but he might be saying that's what Mark did. He presented Jesus' teaching with these, in terms of these kreia. That is very important. And we see this not just in Greek pedagogy in antiquity, but in Jesus, his disciples, the Gospels, in early Christian teaching. And so this is why in gathering the Gospels together and having them side by side, I mean, the early Christians weren't ignorant, they weren't unobservant, they could see the differences, and so what? They're supposed to be there. Because the lessons taught by Matthew are not the same as the lessons and points and applications in Mark, and likewise with Luke and so forth. The stories and teachings of Jesus have been edited and contextualized in ways that lead to clarity. And if you read the handbooks that talk about kreia, they always explain the kreia, the principal teachings of the great master, have to be updated, edited, and so on, in order that there be clarity, that a new audience, a new context, a new situation can understand the teaching properly. The teaching of Jesus has been applied in new ways, and new insights have been discovered as his followers encounter fresh challenges. All of this reflects the way Jesus taught his disciples. It reflects the pedagogy of the time. The disciples were not tape recorders, mere reciters of the Jesus tradition. They were disciples, learners, trained to understand the teaching of Jesus, not simply to repeat it word for word. They were trained to apply it as they gave leadership to the followers of Jesus, a following that in time became known as the church. It is to this training, this ability to apply Jesus' teaching in new and creative ways that the saying of Jesus in Matthew 13 alludes. And I'm reading from Matthew 13, verse 52. Therefore, every scribe who has been discipled or trained for the kingdom of heaven is like a householder who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old. Jesus did not say every scribe who has been discipled for the kingdom of heaven must repeat my words verbatim. In reference to this verse, two major New Testament scholars commenting on the Gospel of Matthew, W.D. Davies and Dale Allison, comment that, quote, the ability to teach things new and old rests upon the ability to understand Jesus' teaching. Precisely. I believe that most Christians do not understand the genre and nature of biblical literature. When it comes to writings that are ostensibly historical, broadly speaking, looks like historical narrative here, there is a tendency to impose upon them modern understandings of what constitutes proper history. When someone is quoted, we expect the quotation to be verbatim and to be set off with quotation marks. We expect strict chronology and sequence. If sources are cited, we expect footnotes. If the Gospels or other writings from late antiquity appear to violate these modern canons of what we think history should be, we speak of contradictions, mistakes, and errors. The Gospels reflect a world quite different from our own. Proper historiography in late antiquity allowed for and sometimes required editing and paraphrasing, always for the sake of clarification. This is what we see in the Gospels. We find in the New Testament Gospels a plausible portrait of the historical Jesus, a portrait that is true to what we know of the time in which Jesus and his disciples lived. This is why so many well-educated, capable scholars make use of the New Testament Gospels as their primary source for studying the life and teaching of Jesus of Nazareth. People who take the Gospels seriously and desire to understand better the Jesus of history have nothing to fear from rigorous critical scholarship. The problem, as I see it, is that far too many do not know what the Gospels are and do not know how to interpret them. Many moderns, whether naive Christians or naive non-Christians, read the Gospels with a modern understanding of what historical writings are supposed to be. This problem is compounded by fundamentalism and what is also called sometimes biblicism, in which the New Testament Gospels and indeed all writings that are found in the Bible are interpreted in rigid and uncritical ways. The type of history conveyed by the Gospels is simply not understood. The discrepancies are forcibly harmonized or ignored, and textual variants are seen as embarrassments. It is believed that all of these things must be done away with if the text is to be trusted. I conclude by calling attention to the recently published book entitled The Bible Made Impossible: Why Biblicism is Not a Truly Evangelical Reading of Scripture, published just last year. The author of this book, Christian Smith, who is on the faculty of Notre Dame University, rightly warns of the danger of defining the Gospels and the Bible as a whole in a way that is out of touch with the data and therefore is completely indefensible. A naive biblicist understanding of the Gospels will sometimes collapse. I'm quoting him now, he says, when antagonistic non-biblicists point out and press home real problems with biblicist theory. Smith quotes Fuller Seminary's professor of Old Testament, John Goldingay, who makes the same point, stating that an unrealistic understanding of narratives in the Bible, quote, sets up misleading expectations regarding the precision of narratives and then requires such far-fetched defenses that it presses people toward rejecting it, end of quote. To this, Smith adds, Biblicism often paints smart, committed youth into a corner that is for real reasons impossible to occupy for many of those who actually confront its problems. End of quote. Believing Christians and those who inquire into the meaning of Christian belief have nothing to fear with regard to the evidence, but will they make the intellectual commitment to become acquainted with this evidence and to put it to good use. I hope they do. If they do not, they will continue to be easy prey for the skeptics who often hold to very dubious theories themselves. Thank you very much.
It is my privilege to now welcome Bart Ehrman, but first let me give him a proper introduction. Professor Bart Ehrman, he is the James A. Gray Distinguished Professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He came to UNC in 1988 after 4 years of teaching at Rutgers University. At UNC, he has served as both the Director of Graduate Studies and the Chair of the Department of Religious Studies. A graduate of Wheaton College in Illinois, Professor Ehrman received both his Master's of Divinity and Ph.D. from Princeton Theological Seminary, where his 1985 doctoral dissertation was awarded magna cum laude. Since then, he has published extensively in the fields of New Testament and early Christianity, having written or edited more than 25 books, numerous scholarly articles, and dozens of book reviews. Among his most recent books are a Greek-English edition of the Apostolic Fathers for the Loeb Classical Library, an assessment of the newly discovered Gospel of Judas, and 4 New York Times bestsellers. Folks, this is rare in biblical studies for a biblical scholar to make it to the New York Times bestselling list. These books include bestsellers such as Jesus Interrupted, which is an account of scholarly views of the New Testament, God's Problem, an assessment of the biblical views of suffering, Misquoting Jesus, an overview of the charges found in the surviving copies of the New Testament and of the scribes and the changes in the manuscripts, and Forged, which discusses why some books in the New Testament are deliberate forgeries. His books have been translated into 27 languages. Among his fields of scholarly expertise are the historical Jesus, the early Christian Apocrypha, the Apostolic Fathers, and the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. Professor Ehrman has served as president of the Southeast region of the Society of Biblical Literature. He was also chair of the New Testament textual criticism section of the Society, book review editor of the Journal of Biblical Literature, and editor of the monograph series, The New Testament in the Greek Fathers. He currently serves as co-editor in the series New Testament Tools, Studies, and Documents, co-editor-in-chief for the journal Vigile Christiane, and on several other editorial boards for journals and monographs in the field. Professor Ehrman has appeared on CNN, the History Channel, the Discovery Channel, The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, and the Colbert Report. Professor Ehrman has 2 children, a daughter Kelly and a son Derek. He is also a grandfather. He has 2 grandchildren. He is married to Sarah Beckwith. She holds a Ph.D. from King's College London, and she is the Marcello Lotti Professor of English at Duke University. Duke and University of North Carolina are not friends when it comes to collegiate sports. We are fortunate to have Professor Ehrman join us in Nova Scotia, all the way from North Carolina. We are very glad that you are here with us. Dr. Ehrman, let me ask you, does the New Testament present a reliable portrait of the historical Jesus? Let's give Dr. Ehrman a warm Nova Scotian welcome as he makes his way to the podium.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, when Sarah, my wife, and I got married 10 years ago, we made a deal that the deal was she was teaching at Duke and I was teaching at North Carolina, and the deal was that we would live near the Duke campus if she would root for the Tar Heels. And that's what happens. So, this event is going to be fun. Craig and I have debated several times in the past, and with this first learned presentation that we just heard, we are going to have a lot to talk about because I disagreed with the whole thing. So we will get to that later. This talk that I'm going to give now is not a direct response to what Craig just said, because I didn't know know what he was going to say. I will be talking about what he had to say in my brief rebuttal. I'm now thinking that these opening talks should have been 5 minutes and the rebuttal should have been 25 minutes, but so it goes. So I will get to what he had to say when I give my rebuttal. How many people in here consider themselves Christians? How many of you consider yourselves Bible-believing Christians? How many of you want to see me get thumped? Right. So, has my time started yet? Hold on a second. I got to turn my timer on. I got to make sure I get this right. Okay. So, right. Let me say something about the topic. This topic that we're debating is about the historical Jesus. We are not asking whether the Bible tells great stories about Jesus or about whether the Bible provides us with an adequate theology of Jesus. We're not debating the literary merits or the theological adequacy of the Bible. We're talking about its historical reliability. Do the Gospels give us a historically reliable portrait of Jesus? We're not asking whether the Bible writers did a good job by the standards of their day. We're talking about our day. Can we, today, trust what the Bible has to say about Jesus historically? In other words, when we read one of the Gospels, can we trust that what it says is something that really happened historically? If it says that Jesus did something, can we trust that he really did it in the way that's described? If a gospel in the Bible says that Jesus really said something, can we trust that he said that thing or not? That's the question we are to be discussing. I started out thinking, as a born-again, conservative, evangelical Christian in my 20s, that the Bible, in fact, was completely reliable in every respect. But the more research I did, the more I began to doubt that the Bible was historically accurate, and I want to tell you why. The way to answer the question about the historical accuracy of the Bible is by considering how one ought to read the Bible. Now, of course, most people don't read the Bible. The people who do read the Bible do so in a variety of ways. One way that many people read the Bible is by what I call the Ouija board approach. Which is that you have a question and you open it up and you close your eyes and you put your finger down, and that is how you read the Bible. That's how you get the answer to your question. So that's fine if you want to read the Bible that way. I have no problem with that. More responsible people who read the Bible tend to read it in a way that I call vertically, which means they read it like you read any other book. And of course, this is a way to read the Bible. You start at the top of the page and you go to the bottom of the page. You start at the beginning of a book and you go to the end of the book. You start with Matthew and you start at very first, chapter 1, verse 1, you read that, then you go to verse 2, then verse 3, you read through the first chapter, then to the second chapter, then the third chapter. You go from top to bottom, reading it vertically. When you read the Bible like that, which of course you should, when you do read the Bible like that, you get a certain impression of the Bible. You read Matthew, and it's about Jesus' life, his death, and his resurrection. And then you read Mark, and it's about Jesus' life, and his death, and his resurrection. And it sounds a lot like Matthew. Then you read Luke. It's about Jesus' life, his death, and his resurrection. It sounds like Matthew and Mark. Then you read John, and it's a little bit different, as Craig was saying, but it's basically the same thing. It's the life and the death and resurrection of Jesus. They all sound alike because of the way you're reading them. If you want to see something else, you should try reading the Bible horizontally rather than vertically. Horizontally reading the Bible means, and I'm not saying this is the only way to read the Bible, but it is one way to read the Bible, and it is better than the Ouija board approach at least. The horizontal way is that you read a story in Matthew, then you read the same story in Mark, and you compare it in detail. Do they tell the same story or not? And if not, are they simply different, or are they at odds with one another? Do they contradict one another? And if they contradict one another, how can they both be historically right? They might be theologically right or religiously right. They might be literarily fantastic, but are they historically accurate if they contradict one another? That's the question, and that comes from reading the Bible horizontally. In graduate school, Craig and I both learned how to read the Bible horizontally, and that's one of the ways we read the Gospels today. When you read the Gospels horizontally, you cannot help but begin to find discrepancies all over the map. This is not a controversial claim. This is not an idiosyncratic view of a particularly liberal professor who teaches at Chapel Hill. Although it is that, but it's not only that. This is the view of every scholar who does this kind of work except for fundamentalists and very, very, very conservative evangelicals. There are discrepancies in the Gospels, and I think Craig is going to agree with me on this. Just take a very simple example. Mark chapter 5 is an interesting story of Jesus healing the daughter of a man named Jairus. Jairus comes up to Jesus and he says to Jesus, "My daughter is ill. Please come and lay your hands on her so you can heal her." And Jesus starts to go to see the girl, but he's interrupted on the way. And before he can get to the house, some servants come from the house and they tell Jairus, "Don't worry because she's dead already and there's no reason to bother the master anymore." Jesus says, "That's not a problem," and he goes to the house. She's dead now, but he raises her from the dead. A beautiful story in Mark chapter 5. Matthew also tells the story in Matthew chapter 9. But in Matthew chapter 9, when Jairus comes to Jesus, he says to him, "My daughter has just died. Can you do something?" Now, wait a second. Now, in Mark's gospel, the girl hadn't died yet. She was sick, but she died when Jesus was delayed. But in Matthew, she's dead already. Well, which is it? Now, many of you are saying, who cares? Well, it's a little detail. But why is it different? It couldn't be both. It couldn't be both. It has to be one or the other or neither. When I'm teaching my New Testament class to my students, I tell them that doing New Testament studies is kind of like doing detective work. A detective's been called on the scene of a crime, and there's a man who's dead in a pool of blood, and the detective starts looking around for little fingerprints and for a strand of hair. And a sensible person would say, "What in the world are you doing? There's a dead body here. Why are you looking for a strand of hair?" It's because a strand of hair can solve the crime. Sometimes the smallest things are what you need. Sometimes small details in the Gospels that are discrepancies show you something about the Gospels. Matthew and Mark cannot both be right about the occasion of Jairus' daughter. There are hundreds and hundreds of examples like that, many of them small, picayune, some of them rather significant. Give you some other examples. Let's think for a second about the birth of Jesus, having come through the recent Christmas holidays. The birth of Jesus is recounted in two of our Gospels, Matthew and Luke. They're both very interesting accounts. One of the most interesting things is that they are completely at odds with one another. Sometime simply read through Matthew chapters 1 and 2 and list everything that happens, and then read through Luke chapters 1 and 2 and list everything that happens and compare your lists. You don't have to take it from me or from anyone else, just do it yourself. They tell many different stories, and sometimes they tell the same story differently. In both accounts, Jesus has a genealogy. The genealogy in Luke happens to come in chapter 3 after Jesus' birth, which is a strange place for a genealogy, but that's where it is. Luke chapter 3. Read the genealogy in Luke and read the genealogy in Matthew and ask yourself, who is allegedly Jesus' father in both? Well, it's Joseph, okay? Both genealogy trace Joseph's bloodline. And so, who is Joseph's father? It's different in Matthew and Luke. Who's his grandfather? Different in Matthew and Luke. Who's his great-grandfather? Different in Matthew and Luke. The genealogies are different between Joseph all the way back to King David. And both genealogies claim to be giving the genealogy of Joseph. Why is that? Well, they probably had different sources, and, they probably didn't know. They had sources that gave them genealogy. Genealogies are odds, but they can't be historically accurate because they're different. You have one father. You don't have two fathers. Well, maybe he was adopted by somebody, and so he had a stepfather. Yeah, maybe. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus is born in Bethlehem, and Herod is out to kill the child. And so Joseph flees with his family to Egypt. Well, it's an interesting story when you put it up against what happens in Luke, because in Luke's gospel, Jesus and his family Joseph and Mary come from Bethlehem to Nazareth, and they stay there until Jesus is born, and then they perform the rites of purification, and then after that, they return to Nazareth. The rites of purification took place 32 days after the birth, according to Leviticus chapter 12. And so in Luke's gospel, they return home a month after giving birth. But in Matthew's gospel, they go to Egypt. How can it be both? Well, today it could be both because you could jump on a jet plane and there'd be no problem. But if you've got to walk to Egypt, it's a long way. What are they doing in Bethlehem in the first place? It depends which gospel you read. In Luke's gospel, the reason they're in Bethlehem is because there's a tax where the entire world has to be taxed under Caesar Augustus. And so Joseph has to register for the tax in Bethlehem because even though he lives in Nazareth, his ancestor David came from Bethlehem. And so he goes to register for the tax in Bethlehem with his betrothed. She gives birth there. After she gives birth there, 32 days later, they go back. I can tell you there was no tax under Caesar Augustus that the whole world had to be taxed, and everybody returned to their ancestral home. Joseph goes to Bethlehem because David was his ancestor. David lived 1,000 years earlier than Joseph. You mean everybody in the Roman Empire, the whole world, is returning to their ancestral home from 1,000 years earlier to register for a tax? Imagine that the Canadian government, in all of its wisdom, decided to impose a new tax on you, and for this tax, you have to return to your ancestral home from 1,000 years ago. Where are you going to go? And no other source mentions this? It didn't even make the newspaper? Why does Luke have this census? Because he has to get Jesus born in Bethlehem, even though he knows that he came from Nazareth. It's a great story, but it didn't happen. There are even bigger events that didn't happen as narrated in the Gospels. And again, you can do this for yourself. Just read the texts horizontally, and you'll see what I mean. The death of Jesus. Both Mark, our earliest gospel, and John, our latest gospel, agree that Jesus died sometime during the Passover feast in Jerusalem, the annual celebration of the Passover. The Jews, of course, continue to celebrate today. Mark is quite explicit. Our first gospel is explicit. Jesus has a Passover meal with his disciples. Afterwards, he goes out and he's arrested. When Judas betrays him, he spends the night in jail, and he's put on the cross the next morning at 9 o'clock a.m., the morning after the Passover meal was eaten. John, our latest gospel, is also quite explicit. There's no word about Jesus and the disciples having a Passover meal. Jesus goes out and he's arrested. He spends the night in jail. He's put on trial, and Pontius Pilate condemns him to death afternoon, not at 9 o'clock, afternoon on the day before the Passover meal was to be eaten. John 19, verse 14 says it explicitly. Well, did he eat the Passover meal or not? In Mark, yes. In John, no. They can't both be right. He didn't get crucified at 2 different times. He got crucified once. Well, which day was it? They both can't be right. There are discrepancies. There are discrepancies in the resurrection narratives of the New Testament. I have my disciples, my disciples at Chapel Hill, do this assignment every year. Just read what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John say about the resurrection and make a list of what each one says and compare your list. Who goes to the tomb? Is it one woman or several women? What are their names? It depends which gospel you read. Was the stone already rolled away before they got there? It depends which gospel you read. What did they see there? Did they see a man there? Did they see two men there? Or did they see an angel there? It depends which gospel you read. What were they told to do? Depends which gospel you read. Did they do it? Depends which gospel you read. Were the disciples supposed to go to Galilee to see Jesus and they did so? Or were they ordered not to leave Jerusalem? And they did so. These are discrepancies. They're not simply differences. Why? Because they are different stories. But if they're different, they can't be accurate. Excuse me, I inherited a cough last week, and I see it's deciding now to reappear at this timely moment. Or else Craig has been praying. Why do you get these discrepancies? Could I have 30 more minutes added to my time, please? Scholars today are convinced that the reason we have discrepancies such as these is because these books were not written by eyewitnesses who accurately recorded the things that happened. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are writing decades after the life of Jesus. Decades later. Probably the first gospel was Mark, maybe around the year 70. I'll be surprised if Craig and I are very different on this, but we may be. But almost everybody puts the Gospel of Mark around the year 70 or so. Matthew and Luke maybe around the year 80 to 85. John maybe around the year 90 or 95. In other words, these Gospels are separated from the life of Jesus by 35 to 65 years. 35 to 65 years. These gospel writers were not the disciples of Jesus. These gospel writers are writing in highly literate Greek. These are highly educated Greek-speaking Christians living decades later. They've heard stories about Jesus that they write down. The stories have been in circulation year after year after year after year by word of mouth. And most of the people telling the stories about Jesus year after year after year were not his disciples, but people who had converted to come to believe in Jesus, who were trying to convert somebody else, who then tries to convert somebody else, who then converts somebody else. Everybody telling stories about Jesus. Of course the stories got changed. When the gospel writers wrote them down, they had their own agendas, and so they changed the stories on occasion in those contexts as well. The stories got changed. That's okay if what you're interested in is the religious significance of the story. But if you're interested in historical accuracy, you don't want stories to change. You want to know what really happened. Sometimes the differences are not discrepancies in detail. Sometimes they're differences in emphases that really matter. I'll give you one example. Mark has a very powerful portrayal of Jesus going to his death. Jesus has been betrayed by one of his followers. He's turned over to Pontius Pilate, and during his trial, Jesus doesn't say anything to Pontius Pilate except Pilate says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus says, "Su leges," you say so. That's all he says. He's taken out to be crucified. He doesn't say anything. He goes to the place of crucifixion. He's silent the entire way. They nail him to the cross, and he's silent. You get the idea of Jesus being in shock at what's happening to him. While he's on the cross, everybody mocks him. The Roman soldiers mock him. The people passing by mock him. Both other people being crucified mock him in Mark's gospel. At the end, Jesus, who has been betrayed and denied and deserted and handed over and condemned and mocked, Jesus on the cross finally cries out, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani." My God, why have you forsaken me? And he dies. Jesus goes to a painful, humiliating death, unsure of why it's happening to him in Mark's gospel. Contrast that with Luke's gospel. In Luke, you have some of the same elements, but a very, very different emphasis. In Luke's gospel, when Jesus is going to be crucified, he's not silent. He sees some women by the side of the road, and he turns his head to them, and he's carrying his cross, and he says to them, "Daughters of Jerusalem, don't weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children, for the fate that's to befall you." Here, Jesus isn't in shock, not wondering why this is happening. He's concerned about these people more than himself. While being nailed to the cross in Luke's gospel, Jesus prays, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." That's not in Mark, that's in Luke. While Jesus is hanging on the cross, it's not that both robbers mock him. One of the crucified people mocks him, and the other turns his head to the man and says to be quiet because Jesus hasn't done anything to deserve this. He then looks to Jesus and he says, "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus replies to him in Luke, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." This is not somebody who's wondering why this is happening to him. He knows what's happening to him, he knows why it's happening to him, and he knows what's going to happen to him after it happens to him. He's going to wake up in paradise, and this guy's going to be with him. At the end, most telling of all, in Luke's gospel, instead of crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Jesus says, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit," and dies. Jesus does not feel forsaken in Luke's gospel. This is a very different portrayal from the one you get in Mark. And the mistake people make is pretending that what Mark has to say is the same thing that Luke has to say, and that what Luke has to say is the same thing that Mark has to say. These are two different gospels with two different points of view. And if you smash them together into one kind of mega gospel, you have ruined the emphasis of each one. And then you throw in Matthew. And he says everything he said, not just in Mark, but in Luke, but also Matthew. Then you throw it in John, and you have the 7 last words of the dying Jesus, which are found in none of the Gospels. Now, you're free to do that if you want, to take all 4 Gospels and smash them together into one big gospel. It's a free world. You can do that if you want. But realize what you're doing. You are writing your own gospel instead of accepting the Gospels that have come to you. Mark has a message that he wants to convey about Jesus, and it is different from Luke's message, and that's different from Matthew's message, and that's different from John's message. If you're interested in the religious value of these books, you have to let each author give you his message and not pretend it's somebody else's message. But what if you're interested not in the religious value of the book, but in the historical accuracy? If you're interested in historical accuracy, 4 discrepant accounts cannot be historically accurate. It can't work. It can't work with Gospels any more than it can work in a criminal courtroom where you have eyewitnesses who say different things. You don't assume they're all right. You try and figure out which one is right. And that's what you do with the Gospels. Sometimes these differences are very big indeed between the Gospels. It is only in the Gospel of John that Jesus declares himself to be divine. Only the Gospel of John portrays Jesus as one who is himself God. You don't get that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Only in John does Jesus say, "I and the Father are one." Only in John does Jesus say, "Before Abraham was, I am." Only John says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." John is quite clear that Jesus is divine. Is that the historical Jesus, or is that a theological Jesus? I think it's perfectly fine if you want to accept that theological point of view of Jesus. But it's a different question from saying that that's historically something Jesus really said about himself. If you're interested in history, you want to know what really happened. Suppose over the next 30 years we ask 4 people to write up biographies of President Jimmy Carter. These 4 people have never heard of Jimmy Carter, like most of my students, for whom Jimmy Carter is ancient history. And these 4 people are not allowed to consult any written documents. They only can use oral reports that they've heard about Jimmy Carter. They can also use one another's works, though. These biographies are then produced by these 4 people who base everything on oral traditions that they've heard. They're collected and they're examined. It turns out they're all quite moving and powerful portrayals of Jimmy Carter, but in a great number of places they contradict each other, often in little ways, but sometimes in large ways, with very different portrayals of who Jimmy Carter really was. In a number of places, they contradict what historians know about the facts of history. And in other places, they make claims for Carter that are clearly historically impossible to have happened. Would you say these sources could be trusted to give you a historically accurate account? Or would you say that if you want to use these sources historically, you have to figure out where there are errors, mistakes, alterations of historical fact, contradictions, exaggerations, and biased reporting? If the latter, then you're saying that you cannot trust them as historical sources. They may contain historical information, but they're not reliable as presentations of who Jimmy Carter was. The Bible also cannot be trusted as a historical source. It may provide great literature, and you may choose to use it for your theological beliefs. You may be able to, moreover, you may be able to determine what actually happened to Jesus based on its biased reporting, but the gospel accounts themselves present non-historical views of Jesus and are not historically accurate. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Bart. What I enjoy about Bart is he tells us what he thinks. Doesn't beat around the bush, but cuts to the chase. Our question is, I'm summarizing it slightly differently, but do the Gospels provide us a reliable portrait of Jesus? And I've answered yes. The question that was not put to us was, are there no discrepancies in the Gospels? Or is everything in the Gospels history? Bart referred to John at the end, and that's not too different from my own assessment of John, where we see in John a mixture of historical details and theological confession, parable, allegory, and metaphor. Nor was our question for tonight, are there no loose ends? Are there no problems that we can't yet explain or answer? As far as eyewitness tradition, and I know Bart and I disagree on this and probably always will, but I believe there is an important core of eyewitness tradition that has fed into the sources that went into the Gospels. On that I refer to the Swedish scholar Samuel Berskog in recent publications, books, and articles, but also Richard Bauckham, the British scholar. I might also refer to Q, that's the tradition that Matthew and Luke both accessed independently of one another, in addition to Mark, which they accessed. The Q tradition is very old. Jimmy Dunn just treats that, but so do others. The Cavella, the source that Matthew and Luke have in common, it's so old that we believe it ultimately is rooted in the pre-Easter Jesus. There's no passion material in it. There isn't or at least very, very little post-Easter perspective in it. So I remind us that the material in the Gospels is selected, it's epitomized, it is summed up and paraphrased, it is condensed, and it oftentimes, maybe even most of the time, is not in a chronological sequence. And when material is presented that way, you condense it this way, but you condense it a different way, then of course you have discrepancies. and to complain that they are therefore imbalanced or not equal, and therefore they can't both be true, is actually to go about the question in a very wooden way. Now, in the fundamentalist world, that is very important. And that is the problem. That's why I took some of my time earlier to caution against that sort of approach. And I suspect there could well be some conservative Christians here not real happy with what I had to say. But I urge you to give that careful consideration. And I don't disagree with some of the statements of fact or some of the descriptions that Professor Ehrman gave, and especially his reference to the horizontal reading. Compare Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You'll see what he means and you'll see what I mean. There are differences, and they are significant, and they need to be taken into account. And I'll close here. Professor Ehrman complains of picking and choosing and mashing together the details and creating a fifth gospel. Well, I understand in part what he is saying there and would agree with it. I'm not advocating harmonizing the four gospels or the three synoptics and creating a new gospel. But at the same time, I remind us all that that's what historians do. They pick and choose among the sources. They pick and choose and sort things out, and they are always confronted with loose ends. They're always confronted with discrepancies that we just don't know how to explain and perhaps never can. But that does not mean that we give up and we look at the materials and say, well, I guess we just don't know what Jesus taught. I guess we just don't know what he did. I guess we just don't know what it is the early Christians were talking about, and we don't know what occasioned their faith and changed their lives and gave them a whole new understanding and worldview. It simply isn't that way. I remind you that this is not just my idea, that this approach is taken by many very capable, able scholars at the finest universities. They're not simple fundamentalists. They're not pretending that all the loose ends can be tied up and all the questions answered. But they do see the Gospels as indeed providing, understood rightly, providing reliable information from which a portrait of Jesus can be constructed that's coherent and really tells us what he taught and what he did. Thank you.
All right, this is the part I like. It's a little bit hard to explain the point I'm going to make, but it's one that I think is an overarching point for my response to Craig's talk. To put it in a blunt way, Craig and I actually appear to be agreeing on most things, but the way he's presenting it involves a kind of sleight of hand. When Craig says that the dominant view among scholars is that we can know something about Jesus, that is absolutely right. And that does not address the topic of the debate. The question of the debate is whether the Gospels provide us with a historically accurate view of Jesus. All of the scholars that he mentioned would say no. Ben Meyer, John Meyer. Three of these people are my colleagues. E.P. Sanders, my colleague for 15 years at Duke. Jody Magnus, whom I hired at UNC. Chris Smith, who was my colleague at UNC before going to Notre Dame. Every one of them would agree that the Gospels do not provide us with historically reliable information, historically reliable accounts of Jesus. Well, then how can Craig be right that we can know something about Jesus? It's because the Gospels, even though they are widely inaccurate, on point after point after point, nonetheless do contain some kernels of historical information. And what historians do, namely these people that give what he's saying is the dominant view, what they do is They get past the contradictions and the discrepancies and the historically false information to what actually happened, acknowledging that the Gospels are full of discrepancies, contradictions, and historically false information. That's what scholars do who quest for the historical Jesus, which means that the Gospels themselves are not historically accurate presentations of who Jesus was and what he said and did. They might contain historical information, but the presentations are not historically accurate. Virtually every scholar on the planet agrees with that, except for fundamentalists and very conservative evangelical Christians who have the point of view that Craig is rightly attacking of some kind of inerrancy view of the Bible. My point is, these discrepancies show that the Gospels are not historically accurate. Does that mean they don't say something on occasion that might be historically right? Yes, they say something on occasion that's historically right. The Jesus Seminar, which you may have heard of before, it doesn't matter if you have or not, spent years and years debating the sayings of Jesus. Which ones actually go back to Jesus? They ended up saying that 22% of the sayings in the Gospels go back to Jesus. In other words, they would accept the dominant view that Craig has laid out for us, that we can know something about the historical Jesus. But in getting to that view, they claimed that 78% of the sayings of Jesus were not actually said by him. I'm not championing the Jesus Seminar because I disagree with a lot of things they do. Fundamentally, I disagree. But I'm just trying to make a point. You can say there are historical nuggets here or there and recognize that these are not historically reliable portraits. Just a couple of other things. Craig wants to insist that our Gospels are better than the second century Gospels historically. He's absolutely right about that. The New Testament Gospels are not historically accurate, and the second century Gospels are even worse. Craig wants to say that the discrepancies do exist in the Gospels. He agrees with me on that, and I am so glad he agrees with me on that. But let me point out that if you have these discrepancies between two Gospels, they can't both be right historically. You might think they're the right theologically, you might think that they're great literature, but they can't both be right historically. The question then, as Craig has paraphrased it, is, do the Gospels provide us a historically reliable portrait of Jesus? And he answers yes. I want him to tell me which one does. He's already told us that the Gospel of John does not, because it links theology and history. But so do Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're not objective biographical accounts of Jesus. They also have the same problem that John has. Which one of our Gospels is historically accurate? If one of them is not accurate, then how can we say that they give us an accurate portrayal of Jesus? In fact, the Gospels are full of discrepancies, they're full of contradictions, they're full of false historical information. They may be valuable to you as a Christian believer. But, as Craig pointed out, historians have to pick and choose. The reason they have to pick and choose is because there's so much historically false information in the Gospels. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We will now move into the dialogue portion of the evening, where both participants will have 3 5-minute opportunities to ask each other direct questions about the other's viewpoints on the evening's topics. We will go back and forth between Dr. Evans and Dr. Ehrman. If you gentlemen both come up and take your seats on the podium.
So let me ask you, Bart, in light of what you just said, are you saying that you cannot derive, or you don't think anyone can derive a historical portrait of Jesus from the Gospels?
No, I think in fact you can. If you look past if you figure out, if you have discrepancies, if you got two accounts that are contradictory to one another, they both can't be right. And so you have to figure out, is one of them right, or are they both wrong? Scholars, of course, have engaged in this for a long time, recognizing that the Bible itself doesn't portray Jesus accurately, but so historians have to reconstruct what Jesus probably was, and I think certainly that is an endeavor that one can do. One can reconstruct a historical Jesus that is not like the portrait of any of the Gospels and say, well, this portrait that we've reconstructed is more likely to be historically accurate.
Okay, I think that I would see that as a very minimalist understanding of what the historical Jesus scholars do. I don't think that these, and I intentionally referred to people in your backyard that you would know, like Ed Sanders, for example. I remind you what Ed said. He doesn't say, you paraphrased him as saying, we can know something. That isn't what he says. He says the dominant view today seems to be that we can know pretty well what Jesus was out to accomplish. He doesn't say absolute certainty with regard to everything, but pretty well what he set out to accomplish.
But you know, okay, how many points did he list that we can know?
Yeah, he starts off with, he lists about 10 or 12.
10 points.
And they're very key points.
But there's not much there. It's 10 points.
Well, his baptism.
Jesus got baptized, okay.
Yeah, principal teaching. And so that's why I say...
But he doesn't think that the Gospels give us a reliable portrayal of Jesus. If the Gospels gave us a reliable portrayal of Jesus, we wouldn't have to engage in scholarship on the Gospels. We could just read the Gospels and say that's what really happened.
Yeah, and I think we might have a semantic issue here because, again, I wonder if our standards of history and how we think history ought to be done, details, completion, and so on, comes into play here. You think of biographies written by great people like Winston Churchill. They're voluminous. What we have are, these Gospels are rather small. You have a selection of activities, certain deeds, acts of power that amaze people, and you have some teachings. The whole of Q, the material, it's probably the biggest source that we have from antiquity of Jesus' teaching is about 270 verses. That isn't much. And so I think in fairness to the Gospels, that's what I'm trying to say is they don't give us a lot. They give us a selection. When we take into account the pedagogical principles, the Crea example that I gave, the rearrangement, the editing, then you end up with these discrepancies. I have students who come to me, probably you too. If I understand you, Professor Ehrman, for this last hour you've been saying this and that, and they give you like 3 sentences.
Yeah, and they're all wrong.
Yeah, but I'm sure, come on now, you say, yeah, you got it. That's right. That's what I was saying, and yet they haven't quoted you. Now, I'm not saying that there's that much of a discrepancy, but so when we talk about, well, they can't be both right, well, actually they can. Because the teaching has been condensed this way in this stream of tradition. It's been condensed a little differently in this stream. It's been applied here. And so when we say, well, it can't both be right, aren't we not being a little bit atomistic in our contextualization and making demands that are really a little strange?
No, because I'm not talking about Crea. I mean, you know, you've been talking about the Crea, and
but they include deeds too.
Yeah, I know, but people here don't know. But I didn't mention Crea at all. I'm talking about flat-out contradictions.
Yeah, and that can come about. And see, when we end up with that, when we say, well, no, wait a minute, was he in this village or was he in that village when he said this? I agree with you. He can't have been in both places.
30 seconds.
And nor do we know, in fact, we don't know. But was he in these villages in Galilee? The answer is yes. Was he doing this kind of teaching?
Right, but if he wasn't in both villages, it's inaccurate.
Yeah, and I would concede that those are the kinds of things that are left dangling where we don't know. But that does not prevent the historian from finding the Gospels as reliable and useful in giving us a portrait. And I use the contrast with Gospel of Thomas and so on, because there's no way we would end up with a reliable or genuine portrait of Thomas, you know, if it was from Thomas.
Okay, so this isn't working well because you were going to be asking me questions and I was going to be, and it just went the other way. So, right, so,
it's okay.
So let's try this again. Okay, now it's apparently my turn. Is it my turn? Okay, all right.
Go ahead.
All right. Right. So am I right that you agree that there are contradictions and discrepancies in the Gospels?
Yes.
And do you agree that if there are contradictions between two accounts, they both cannot be historically accurate?
In a certain qualified sense, yes.
Okay.
No, which, by the way,
Can we go home now?
This happens in the courtroom setting with eyewitnesses. There's nothing strange.
Oh, no,
here.
no, I don't think there's anything strange about it at all. It's just that, but it means that you can't read the Gospels at face value to give you a historically accurate portrayal of Jesus.
Ah, thank you at last for saying that. Read them at face value. Exactly. In whose face? Reading it how? That was the point that I was trying to make, to understand what they are attempting to do. Here's his teaching. I'll say this much. No, I'll say more. No, I'll say little. It's conditioning the teaching as well as the deeds and putting them in a variety of contexts. Actually, if you look, you'll notice that many things Jesus says and many things he does, we don't even know where he is. Often we assume he's still in Galilee, but we don't even know that. And so we don't have as much information there as we wish we had. And that's the point that I'm making. Now, maybe it's mostly semantics in our use of the word reliable.
I think we're actually pretty much agreeing.
Again, I come back, if the Gospels, I think the rhetoric, Bart, that you use sometimes might lead the person who is not a biblical scholar with the impression that the task is hopeless, or, well, who knows what Jesus said.
No, I wrote
I
wrote a whole book showing what Jesus really said and did. And so it's not that I think it's hopeless, but I think the problem is that most people, when you ask, does the New Testament present a historically reliable portrayal of Jesus, what they're thinking is, in other words, if I read the Gospel of Matthew and it says that Jesus did this, this, and this, and he said this, this, and this, can I trust that that's really what he said and did? And the scholar answers no.
Well, I don't agree with that. I think...
Which of the scholars that you named, of all the scholars you named, which one of them would say that the Gospels portray Jesus in a historically... In other words, that if you read the Gospel, it's telling you what actually happened? Which of the scholars?
Well, I think all of them that I mentioned.
Oh, Craig, none of them.
No, yes, they would, but they would qualify. I wish they were here so they could defend themselves, but they would qualify it. I mean, see, you're going back, I think you're asking the Gospels to give us videotape. That's why I'm trying to say they don't do that.
No, they don't give us videotape. We agree on that. I think most people expect that they do.
Yeah, that's right.
But they don't. But if the Gospels are full of discrepancies and contradictions and historically false information, people conclude then that they're not historically accurate. You might be able to get historical information out of them, but they are not historically accurate accounts.
Well, if you can't get sufficiently accurate information at a sufficient amount, accurate enough and sufficient amount that you can come up with a plausible and most likely accurate historical account. And that's, by the way, you realize that's saying a lot, anything that's 2,000 years ago. We could be saying this, we could be talking about Alexander the Great and be faced with the same problem. Then I think we are talking about reliable sources. I think it's fair to use that adjective when we're talking about that without saying to be reliable, you have to have sources with no discrepancies, no contradictions of that nature.
Okay, so the Gospel of Peter, outside of the New Testament, has King Herod, it has Pilate, it has Jesus get crucified, it has two robbers, it has an account of his death and his burial, setting the guard. Would you consider that all historically accurate information?
A lot of it, yes.
Okay, so do you think the Gospel of Peter is a historically reliable account of the life of Jesus?
In a certain qualified sense, you could say yes.
Oh,
which is probably why a lot of people read it. But it contains a lot of other things that are at variance with the Gospels that are clearly
I know, but nobody's going to argue
like the talking cross, the angels that are miles high.
Nobody's going to argue that the Gospel of Peter is historically accurate, are they?
Well, they would. It's derivative. It's, I think, a rewrite of the Gospel of Matthew.
Yeah, largely. It's not historically accurate, but it has historical information in it.
Sure,
that's what the Gospels are.
Well, I think we do have a little bit of a semantic difference on that.
Okay, now you get to ask questions.
Well, I guess I could ask, just sound you out on this. This is not kind of I'm trying to pin you down question, but is the task that are undertaken by many scholars like John Meyer at Notre Dame and others, is the quest, you might call it, for the historical Jesus one that's worth pursuing?
Absolutely. And the reason you have to pursue it is precisely because the Gospels don't give us historically accurate portrayals. If they did, you wouldn't have a quest. All you would have to do is read Matthew and say, oh yeah, Jesus said this, Jesus said that. It says so right here. Jesus did this, yep, it says right here. That, and he did everything that's said in there. But the fact is you can't do that because everybody involved in the quest, except for fundamentalists and very conservative evangelicals, everybody else recognizes that the Gospels, as they come to us, are not historically accurate, and therefore you have to use very refined and rigorous historical methodology in order to figure out what in there is a historical nugget in the midst of all the contradictions and discrepancies.
I would just challenge you on one point here, and think about that. Even if we had... we were convinced that Matthew is a videotape recording. The quest of the historical Jesus is still necessary because the context is lost. There are so many details that are not there. There are still very, very many loose ends. And just for example, in Matthew 11, you have the interesting story where messengers come from John the Baptist, who was an associate and mentor and predecessor of Jesus. John has been arrested by Herod Antipas. He's in prison. John evidently is discouraged. He sends messengers to Jesus, and they ask him the question, are you he who is to come, or should we look for somebody else? Now, most commentators say, that's an authentic passage, because why would anyone make up a story where Jesus is in danger of losing his endorsement from John the Baptist? So Jesus replies and says, well, go back and tell John what you see and hear, that the blind regain their sight, lepers are cleansed, the dead are raised, the poor have good news preached to them. And the question then is, well, was that a messianic exchange or not? Was it a messianic affirmation or not? There was a time when you and I were in Ph.D. studies in the 70s, it was routine for critical scholars to say, well, no, it's not messianic. Jesus probably didn't have a messianic consciousness. Well, Matthew, it introduces the passage. Luke has it also in Luke 7, but it's Matthew, the evangelist, who introduces it this way. When John was in prison and heard about the works of the Messiah. So Matthew, the evangelist, understands it as having something to do with Messiah. A lot of people thought, as perhaps you might have then too, or I don't know, well, Matthew he's wrong. Jesus isn't messianic in his understanding. He just adds that from a post-Easter perspective. And then along comes a discovery at Qumran in one of the caves, Cave 4. And it turns out he's right. And the scroll has very similar language about what happens when the Messiah comes, whom heaven and earth will obey. The blind will regain their sight. People will be healed. Dead will be raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them. Turns out Matthew was right. And this is part of it too. And so it might be a videotape, but we still don't quite understand the whole story. So I would contend that the academic work, the historical work is required all the time, because sometimes we really don't know quite what we're looking at. We know we don't quite have the whole story. And as we acquire more information through archaeology, through other literature that's published, sometimes these loose ends are tied together, and sometimes we find out we were flat out right wrong in a negative judgment that we had entertained at an earlier time.
Thank you for that question. I'm just going to say I completely agree with you, and I would not argue that if Matthew were a videotape, then scholarship would no longer be necessary. I wouldn't argue that.
Okay, good. I forgot. Who's asking questions now? Am I?
The answer is no one. You are, I think.
Oh, okay.
Let's move on to Bart.
My turn. Okay, good. Right. Okay. So, in the Gospel of John, Jesus says a lot of I am sayings, very famous sayings. Before Abraham was, I am. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world, etc. These I am sayings. And at one point, of course, he says, the Father and I are one. So my question to you is, do you think the historical Jesus really said these things?
I think most of these things were not uttered as we find them by the historical Jesus. So I suspect we don't have too much difference on John. My view is the Gospel of John is a horse of another color altogether. It's a different genre. John is often compared to the wisdom literature. It's like wisdom is personified. Chokmah, Lady Wisdom, or in Greek, Sophia. She wanders the streets, she calls out to people, she does things. Well, nobody would read that and think, oh, did you see Wisdom going down the street the other day? Nobody would think that as a literal person. What is mysterious to me about John is that once you say that and say, okay, perhaps we should interpret the I am statements as he is confessions, he is the light of the world, he is the way, truth, and the life. He is the bread of life. A confession of the Johannine community that likely generated that version of the gospel. About the time you think John is a gigantic parable, and then along comes a scholar who says, you know, it's loaded with historical details also. And so that's what makes John so tricky. There is a Society of Biblical Literature section devoted to John and the historical Jesus, chaired by a scholar named Paul Anderson. So that's probably more answer than you want, but I don't disagree with you too much on that point. No. I think John is studded with historical details. Yeah. Maybe you called them nuggets. That's not a bad way of describing John. Okay. But I think the synoptics are more than just some nuggets.
Okay, so let me just add to pursue it then. I mean, John, I think both of us are agreeing that John is not historically accurate. It's theologically been probably the most important of the Gospels, I would say, historically, and people relish the theological. But in terms of its historical accuracy, if you were there, you would not have heard Jesus say these things, probably. It's a later theological reflection.
Not in so many words, not like that. No,
okay.
I don't think so.
So if we toss John out, what about...
We're not tossing John out, but... And by the way, Bart, I object to saying it's not historically accurate. Well, if something that isn't exactly historical, how is it not historically accurate? It'd be like saying, you mean the parable? The parable was a fiction that Jesus told? It's not an actual event? You mean it's not historically accurate?
Right. Well, we would have to argue what John was intending to produce, whether he was
That's exactly what the question is.
And we have no access to his intentions.
And that's and that's true for anything from antiquity, I suppose.
Okay, so
that's why we do exegesis.
All right, so if we agree that John is not historically accurate, which one of the Gospels is? All right, no, you have said that Jesus didn't say, okay, you are not going to use John as a blueprint for writing the historical life of Jesus because you think it's
Fair
metaphorical.
Enough.
So, which gospel then is historically accurate?
I think as far as the synoptic gospels are concerned, I would say all three.
They're all three accurate?
Of course.
But they have discrepancies.
Yes. And accurate sources that cover the ground differently and selectively do. Now, if you were to ask me this, which of the three Gospels is in a strict chronological order, I would say neither one. If you were to say which one consistently quotes Jesus verbatim, I'd say none of them does that. See, so that's why I'm getting back to we must understand historiography, what we're writing, what we mean by history. It's not tape recording, it's not videotaping.
This is why I think it's a sleight of hand.
I don't think it is.
Because if you read an article in the newspaper about an event that happened...
The newspaper today or 2,000 years ago? So
you're
using
reading
the
Jerusalem
modern
Times.
example.
No. The question is, are they historically accurate? It's not, were they done according to ancient protocols of historiography? That's not the debate topic. The debate topic is, are they historically accurate? And my point is that if you read an article in the newspaper that records things that didn't happen, that says things that were not said, you would not come away saying that's historically accurate.
I don't know if that is true, though, with respect to the Synoptic Gospels, to say these are things not said or events not done.
You just said that, in fact, they contain things that did not happen.
No, I'm referring to the Synoptics.
Yes.
Yeah.
You think everything in the Synoptics happened, that everything's recorded historically accurately in the Synoptics?
I would answer it the way I think any historian would with regard to any ancient text, and that is there are things where we are very confident these happened. There are other things where we think they're probable. There are other things we think, well, we're not really sure. Then there might be, at the edges, some things where some would dogmatically say, I don't think these occurred. The trying to prove the negatives, those are the ones that make me uneasy. So for me, most of the synoptic tradition is authentic. The rest of it, there are parts of it, I'm not sure. And I leave it at that.
So time means what? It's his turn to ask questions?
Yeah, he gets to ask you questions.
Okay.
Well, Greg, in my own view, I mean, I don't think I have any particular questions for Bart. Part of it is just obviously we've been around and around this mulberry bush before. I'm quite content to go to questions from the audience now, if that's okay with you, Bart.
I do have one more question.
Well, then you go ahead. I'm game.
Okay. My question would be, do you agree with what's I would say probably the majority of scholars since Albert Schweitzer, that Jesus is best understood as some kind of Jewish apocalyptic prophet?
Yes, but I'd have to hear your definition of apocalyptic, because I don't think Schweitzer understood what apocalyptic meant. And I'm not sure the Jesus Seminar has a clue what that means.
No, they don't.
Oh, well, okay. Yeah. Apocalyptic is a Greek word that basically means a revelation or something that's revelatory. It often gets tied in with North American modern ideas about the end of the world, which occurred, I guess, October 21st. So why are we here anyway? Yeah, no, but was Jesus proclaiming from a revelatory point of view, has a vision, understands the rule of God and things changing in his time? I think that was, yes, very much part of his proclamation, yes.
Okay. As mentioned earlier, questions have been texted in for both Dr. Ehrman and Dr. Evans, and we will now move into a time of Q&A. First question is for Dr. Ehrman. The example of Jimmy Carter is hardly relevant. The disciples knew Jesus and lived with Jesus. How can that be compared with 4 students who knew nothing about Jimmy Carter?
No, that's a great question. It's a great question. There are very few scholars today who think that the Gospels were written by 4 people who were with Jesus. Even in the traditional inscriptions to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Mark was not one of the disciples of Jesus. He was a companion of Peter. Luke was not a disciple. He was a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. Matthew allegedly was the tax collector with Jesus. John allegedly was the beloved disciple. That's the traditional view. Most critical scholars don't believe that anymore. The Gospels were not written by people who were eyewitnesses. And the first point to stress is they don't claim to be. Matthew does not claim to be written by somebody named Matthew. Mark doesn't claim to be written by Mark. These ascriptions of authorship were added later, much later, decades later. The original authors wrote anonymously. The one thing we know about these authors is that they were highly educated Greek-speaking Christians who were rhetorically trained in Greek composition because the Gospels are written in very good Greek, following Greek rhetorical strategies. The disciples of Jesus were not Greek-speaking people, and they were not highly educated. According to the book of Acts, chapter 4, John and Peter were were agrammatoi, which is the word for illiterate, they were unlettered, and that's probably right. These were people who lived a hand-to-mouth existence and were not educated. Very few people in the ancient world were educated. Probably at this time in Palestine, the best estimates indicate that at this time in Palestine, only 3% of the population could read. Far fewer people could actually write, and almost nobody, in fact, nobody that we know of, except for Josephus later, could write in Greek. So whoever wrote these books were later Christians living somewhere else who were not disciples of Jesus, and that's precisely why I chose the Jimmy Carter illustration, because the people who wrote these books would have been the people who would be like someone today writing about Jimmy Carter, having heard about him, not having lived with him.
Okay, Dr. Evans, in your popular book, Fabricating Jesus, you discuss the various criteria of authenticity that scholars use to reconstruct historical portraits of Jesus. Clearly, these criteria cannot apply to every aspect of the life of Jesus. Are there any sayings of Jesus or activities in the Gospels that you are skeptical about?
Now, that's a very good question. Yeah, the criteria, by their very nature, they look for sayings, and sometimes they're applied to deeds that can pass the test of the criteria. Now, some of the criteria are a little wonky, and some have been either modified or set aside. For example, one criterion says if a saying occurs in two or more independent streams of tradition, its claimed authenticity is strengthened because it's not likely to just be a ringer that floated into one stream. A ringer might get into one stream, but would it get into two or three independent streams? It's not likely. So anyway, and then on it goes. There are other criteria. There are sayings attributed to Jesus. We'll just stick with the sayings that, as far as we can tell, don't meet the criteria. And that is partly why the Jesus Seminar, Bart referred to it as regarding as uncertain or inauthentic, like 78% of the gospel materials. And it's because, in large measure, lots of materials don't fit the criteria. And I think they had some of the criteria wrong, and there were other problems of context. So, yeah, like I've already mentioned the Gospel of John as an example of that. It's singly attested. So the distinctive material in John is not found in multiple sources, but only in one. But also it doesn't fit the early first century Jewish setting, and oftentimes it doesn't agree with the synoptic Jesus in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, who talks a different way. And so the Johannine sayings, the distinctive ones, with a few exceptions, they're the ones that look like, as I said earlier, a different genre altogether, something that only incidentally has historical material in it, but otherwise is a completely different type of literature, more like wisdom literature, where Jesus is portrayed as wisdom personified and walks and talks like wisdom.
Okay, Dr. Ehrman, you seem to suggest that the only way we could believe the gospel accounts of Jesus is if they agree in every single detail. Couldn't you then argue collusion?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. First of all, I'm not talking about believing in the gospel accounts. I'm talking about whether we can accept them as historically reliable. You can believe in things that are not historically reliable, that cannot be historically proven, for example. And so I'm not talking about belief. I'm talking about historical knowledge. If the Gospels agreed in every single detail, then yes, you would expect collusion. So my students have trouble believing this. So, Craig, I don't know if you do this when you teach the synoptic problem, but it's hard to get students to understand. Craig's been talking about the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the thing about them is that they tell many of the same stories, and the stories are often in the same sequence of the stories. Jesus did this, he did this, he did this, he did that. Same sequence among the Gospels. And sometimes they're word for word the same.
And so I have trouble sometimes getting my students to believe me when I tell them that if you've got three sources that give the same story in the same sequence, in the same words, somebody's copying somebody. And so my students don't believe that. So what I do is I have this little exercise where I come into the class period is meeting, and I come in class a little bit late, and I start fidgeting around. I put down my bag. I take out some papers. I throw them on the table. I take off my jacket. I put it back on. I mean, I start doing things. And everybody's looking at me wondering why I'm not teaching. Then I stop. I do this for a couple of minutes. I stop. I say, okay, now I want everybody to write down what you've seen me do. And so everybody in the class writes down what they've seen me do. And then I take 3 volunteers. Say, okay, we're going to compare these 3 and see if they have the same story in the same sequence in the same words. And I compare, and I say, anybody in here, tell me if you've got a sentence that's exactly like any of these sentences in any of these 3. And I read through the 3, and they're always completely different, even if they're talking about the same thing. And usually they're talking about different things. And so then I say, okay, what would you think if I picked up two of these papers and they had a paragraph that was exactly alike? I say, well, somebody copied from someone. Yeah, somebody copied from someone. I say, now, what would you think if I waited 30 or 40 years, and instead of asking you, I asked a cousin of a friend of somebody who once knew somebody in the class who was a friend of yours, and they got exactly the same thing, word for word. What would you think then? And some kid in the back row always cries out, it's a miracle. Okay, right. It's either a miracle or somebody's copying somebody. So that's absolutely right. If they're word for word the same, you'd expect collusion. But the thing is, you could have historically accurate accounts that are not word for word the same, that are different from one another, that are still accurate. So just because there's a difference does not mean there's a discrepancy. You can have different accounts that are historically accurate without discrepancies. What I'm talking about are the discrepancies.
Okay, Dr. Evans, to what degree are the historical writings in Matthew and Luke concerning the birth and early life of Jesus accepted among the scholars you had mentioned at the beginning of your talk?
The early life of Jesus, well, let's just stay with the birth narratives, because the early life of Jesus is practically unreferenced, with the exception of what's called the finding at the temple when Jesus is 12. So otherwise, we're just talking about the infancy narratives. Of the 27 writings of the New Testament, only 2 refer to that. Of the 4 Gospels, it's only 2. And Professor Ehrman has referred to those, and there are discrepant. And that is, there are 11 features in common, at least as pointed out by the late Raymond Brown in his large study of this whole thing called The Birth of the Messiah. And so by the very nature of this material, the very nature of this whole issue, this is very, very difficult to come to terms with, because where's the public? See, when we're talking about the historical Jesus, you know, what we're really talking about is the public Jesus who walks about in Galilee, who journeys south and ends up in Jericho and then Jerusalem during Passion Week, seen by lots of people, has his own inner following, his close followers, people he is teaching. None of that applies to the infancy narratives. And so there's the difficulty. I mean, you start talking about the Immaculate Conception, who's there? You know, you see what I mean? And I'm not trying to be cheeky about this. I'm just making a point. I mean, and Jesus is not famous. He's unknown, see, as a child. Whatever his mother may have treasured up in her heart, he's not known. And I mean, the evidence for that is seen in his adult ministry. He goes to Nazareth, the village in which he had been raised, and he's not treated with much respect. Who's this guy? I mean, his family lives here. We know his brothers and sisters. We know his mother. Where's he? You know, he thinks he's a big shot. I mean, I'm paraphrasing. But that's Mark 6, you see. And so you look at that, you think, and so because of that, you have this very weakly attested tradition. But what does Raymond Brown say in his 700-page study, the whole thing? The infancy narratives do seem to be independent of one another. There doesn't seem to be collusion between Matthew and Luke. So, and it's very much like Professor Ehrman's example with his students. They're writing these accounts, they're looking at things, and they're writing these accounts, and then they're not identical. There's no evidence of collusion, and yet you have 11. Now, don't ask me what those 11 are. I'll have to do my Rick Perry imitation and go, well, 1, 2, gee, I can't remember. But in any case, but there are 11 points, trust me, in common, and yet it's not a, there's no collusion. So when I go to the infancy narrative as a historian, I say, I don't know what's going on here. There's very, very little to establish here from a historical point of view. And so there it is, it's just, whoops, I don't know. And I think that's a prudent view. Now, if you want to say, oh, well, it's just all been made up, you have the freedom to do that, but you might not be treating the sources fairly at that point.
Okay. Dr. Ehrman, if the Gospels are not historically reliable documents, what do you think the Gospels are reliable for, if anything? Why do you study them?
Yeah, good question. I get asked this a lot. I would argue the Gospels are the most important pieces of literature written in the history of Western civilization. There are, as Greg pointed out at the beginning, there are 2 billion people in the world who consider themselves Christian, who ultimately rely on the Gospels on one level or another for what they believe. But the Gospels are important for all the other billions of people too, at least the ones in the Western world. The most significant institution in the history of the West is the Christian Church, not just religiously and theologically, but politically, culturally, socially, economically. The Christian Church has dominated the history of the West. And at the heart of at the foundation of the Christian Church is the New Testament. And at the heart of the New Testament are the Gospels. These are the most important books that have been written in our form of civilization. So who wouldn't want to read them? Why wouldn't you want to know about them and what they really are? I study them not for religious reasons, but for historical and cultural reasons, because I think they are as important as it gets. I've got, my wife was mentioned, who's a medievalist who teaches at Duke, and she's an expert on medieval English. So she teaches a class on Chaucer. Well, Chaucer is extremely important. She doesn't teach Chaucer because she believes in Chaucer. She teaches Chaucer because it's important to English literature. Well, if Chaucer's important, how important are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? So they're incredibly important, whether you happen to believe in them or not.
Okay. Dr. Evans, if we are to read the Gospels without our modern-day historical perspective of chronology and critical thinking, how do we read them?
Yeah, very good question. Well, we should, I think, read them the way they intended to be read. And that's why comparing them to the way other biographies and historical accounts in antiquity were written, if you investigate the subject, you discover that the ancients didn't all agree on how history should be done. That's an interesting discussion in itself. Some talk about chronology, some say it's not important, the approach should be topical. Some think you should focus on just the great events. Others think you should focus on great men, and so forth. So it's a very interesting discussion, and beginning with Herodotus and Thucydides, 5th century BC Greek historians, really the inventors of the whole concept of historiography, as far as we know. And then there were some great historians in the later classical era, Greek and Roman alike. And so I think that's why I keep saying we need to study the Gospels in that setting. I found it very enlightening 25 years ago when the Crei, particularly, how you take the teachings of a great teacher, a great person, a great figure, a great philosopher, how you then conserve and transmit those teachings. And Classical historians and students knew about this material much longer, but it was, as I recall, in the early to middle 80s that it took the New Testament discipline by storm, and people realized, oh, look at that, it really does apply to the Synoptic Gospels. And then, of course, that's when we began to think maybe we've misunderstood Papias, the early 2nd century church father whose work is lost to us, but we have some fragments, some quotations, where he actually uses the word creai in reference to Mark. And so that's why I say you've got to study the writings in their time and understand what they were trying to do then, and not judge them harshly by saying, well, they don't supply the information we want, or they don't do the history the way we think it ought to be done now. By the way we think history ought to be done now might be considered very strange 100 years from now. And so historical theory, not every generation sees it the same way. And so that's why I stress that. And there's a lot of room for growth and learning and knowledge if you go back and say, let's put them in their original context. And so my complaint is that whether it's Christians or non-Christians, lots of people just don't do that. They don't read the Gospels that way. Jimmy Dunn refers to it as a default setting. The default setting is just to read them through our modern eyes and just assume they should be evaluated as if it's a newspaper report, or it's a modern day report of an event, or as if it were verbalizing videotape or something like that. And that's what we have to safeguard against.
Okay, one final question for each participant. Dr. Ehrman, what is your opinion of arguments that deny the existence of Jesus or believe that all of the stories of Jesus originate from other ancient myths like Egyptian myth? It seems like your arguments for not trusting the Gospels could be used in favor of doubting Jesus' existence. What do you think about this?
This is a softball. The reason it's a softball is because I have just written a book on this topic that will appear in March. March 20th, available at your local bookstore. Where I show why historians who are serious historians have no doubt at all that Jesus actually existed. In fact, there is abundant evidence for Jesus, and I think we can say a good deal about Jesus. Craig and I are on the same page about this, and probably at the end of the day, our views of who the historical Jesus was are not all that different. But there is compelling and I think overwhelming evidence that Jesus actually existed. The fact that the Gospels have discrepancies and historical inaccuracies and contradictions and factually false information is worth knowing, but it does not impinge on the question of whether Jesus actually existed or not. If you took four of the Republican candidates for the nomination right now and asked for their opinions about Barack Obama, you would get four probably wildly inaccurate, in my point of view, opinion. But that doesn't mean Barack Obama didn't exist.
Okay. Dr. Evans, your final question. The Gospel of John seems to present a different Jesus than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Do you think John presents a reliable portrait of Jesus? And should we trust that those long speeches in John actually originate from Jesus?
Well, let me elaborate on the answer I gave earlier because I have already answered that, but let me restate. On a historical level, let us suppose we could go back into time with a camera team and audio and video record the historical Jesus, and we followed him about throughout his ministry. I would be very surprised if we caught him uttering, I am this and I am that, in one of these big, long speeches that we find in John. Okay, so this, I'm just taking a different tack, but I'm saying the same thing I said before. This aspect of the Gospel of John I would not put in the category of historical. It's a genre question. The real question then would be, do these, from a theological point of view, reflect an accurate theological understanding of Jesus' person, his accomplishment, what he's achieved, what he brings to his believers? Is he the light of the world? Is he, the way, the truth, and the life? Is he the bread of life? See? And that's what Christians can affirm. Now, this difference of the portrait of Jesus in John compared to the synoptics, this was not lost on the early church. There were church fathers that have grave reservations about John. In their mind, John should have been a fourth synoptic gospel, but it wasn't. And so they were advocating its exclusion from the collection of writings to be read in churches. And that's, of course, what eventually gave us the canon and what we call the New Testament. So you could say, theologically, these affirmations of who Jesus is, in fact, do derive from Jesus, not because he walked around and said them, but because of what he did, what he said, what he did, and because of his resurrection. And so this community that comes together in the aftermath of Easter says, you know what? This Jesus who said these various things, whose teaching we cling to and interpret and present and adapt and so on, he is for us the way, the truth, and the life, the true vine. He is the bread of life and so on. And so then that gets presented in a very creative, dramatic, and metaphorical way in what we now call the Gospel of John. So I'm urging people here, traditional Christians or conservative Christians, to take a new look at John and not fret over how you can make it harmonize with the synoptic Jesus. This is the way scholars usually talk. But to look at John as doing something else. It's not a fourth synoptic gospel, but it really is a different genre and has a different purpose and is going about the task in a very different way.
Okay. We will have closing statements, and both Dr. Evans and Ehrman will have 5 minutes. We will start with Dr. Evans, and when he's finished, Dr. Ehrman, you can come up and give your closing statement.
Well, I do acknowledge there might be a semantic difference and a point of emphasis, but I stand by what I have maintained this evening, that the Gospels are indeed reliable sources for the historical Jesus, and if that was not so, we would not be in a position to talk about what Jesus said, and there's much that we can say about what he said. We would not be in a position to say this is his message, or this was his mission, or these are the kinds of things that he did, or this is the way he impacted his contemporaries. We can say a great deal about what people believed in him, what they believed about him. We can say a lot of things about his followers. We can say also a lot of things about his antagonists and why it was they resisted him, disagreed with him, were violently opposed to him. We can say a lot about the final week, the Passion Week, and why the controversies that Jesus engaged in with the temple authorities, and why it was that he was arrested, interrogated, and eventually handed over to a Roman governor who condemned him to the cross. There is much that we can say. We wish we could say more. We wish the Gospels provided us with greater detail. We wish that, they just simply, you might say, glossed the story a little more and explained it more. It would make it much easier for us. But given the fact that this is a person who ministered in Galilee, I wouldn't go so far as to call it a backwater, but it is Galilee. And his ministry was mostly focused on villages. He didn't go to Sepphoris, as far as we know. He didn't go to Tiberias. He didn't go to Caesarea Maritima. He didn't go to the big cities in or around Galilee. The only big city he went to, as far as we know, is Jerusalem. So here is this Galilean Jew who goes village to village and has a ragtag handful of disciples, and it grows to maybe a few hundred. Disciples who were not philosophy giants or literary giants, and yet why would he create any wake at all? He's such a seemingly so small pebble in the great Roman Empire, where the giants are somebody like Caesar Augustus. So who is Jesus? And so here he is, and you might look back and think, we shouldn't know anything about this fellow. I mean, surely there were other insignificant people wandering around in the villages of Galilee. And yet here it is, here we are today, 2,000 years in this auditorium filled at this distinguished university talking about him. And I think it's because he made a big wake. And it wasn't a fluke, it wasn't an accident, he wasn't an insignificant person that didn't have much to say, whose following couldn't remember anything he said anyway, who simply made up and told stories that weren't really true either. And then we have 4 discrepant accounts, and the world has changed. I don't find that a plausible explanation. I find more plausible that he did do significant things and say significant things, and his followers told the stories accurately. There was a collective memory. There was an eyewitness core and tradition, and the Gospels faithfully reflected, even if we can't tie together all the loose ends, and even if there are the discrepancies. And that, I suggest to you, is a better explanation for what happened in the next 2,000 years and why we're here tonight. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank everybody for being so gracious during our presentations, and Craig for a very lively back and forth. I think there are some things that Craig and I agree on. We agree that the Gospel of John is not an account that you want to go to if you want to know what historically happened in the life of Jesus. We agree that the Gospels have discrepancies and contradictions. We agree that if 2 accounts have contradictions, they cannot both be historically accurate. We also agree that the New Testament does contain some information that is historical. Where we disagree is somewhat more interesting, I think. Craig thinks that we should judge the Gospels, as he's intimated on a couple of occasions at least, by ancient standards. Were these Gospels doing what ancient people would have done if they were trying to record events that had taken place in their environment? My view is we could probably debate that, whether these are good historical records by an ancient standard. The problem is that isn't what we are talking about. The question is, do they provide us with historically reliable portrayals of Jesus? Do they provide us with historically reliable portrayals of Jesus? Craig answers yes. He thinks they do, and I heartily disagree. The Gospels do contain historical information here and there, but large tracts of the Gospels are historically inaccurate. If they are inaccurate in story after story, how can we say that the overall portrayal is accurate? You cannot read any one of the Gospels and come away with a historically accurate understanding of what Jesus said and did. That, I think, is the reality that we have to face. Are they accurate then? I would say, no, they're not accurate. The only way we can get a historically accurate portrayal of Jesus is by applying scholarship to the Gospels, by applying the criteria that Craig has talked about, the criteria for authenticity. You have to do that in the Greek. For the sayings of Jesus, you have to reconstruct them back into Aramaic. You have to apply rigorous historical methodology. In other words, the only way to make the Gospels historically accurate is to be a scholar. If you're not a scholar, you cannot read them and know what is historically accurate. That, at least, seems to me to be the conclusion that Craig is giving us. In my point of view, the Gospels are not historically accurate because when you read them, you're reading inaccurate information. They are much like the Gospel of Peter. The Gospel of Peter is a 2nd century text that nobody thinks is historically accurate. But it has the verisimilitude that Craig wants to talk about. It, in fact, has an ancient manuscript tradition that Craig wants to talk about. It has people named in it: Pilate, Herod, Jesus, the Jewish leaders, Joseph of Arimathea, the people being crucified with Jesus, the two criminals. It has the flogging of Jesus, the crucifixion of Jesus, the burial of Jesus. It has historically accurate information in it. Would anybody want to say that it's a historically accurate portrayal of Jesus? No, nobody would. Because if you read it, you'll read about Jesus who comes out of his tomb as a giant taller than a mountain and a cross walking behind him, speaking to heaven, a walking, talking cross. Is this a historically accurate portrayal? No, nobody thinks it is. But it has historically accurate information. Well, the Gospels of the New Testament are like that. They have nuggets in them that are historically accurate, but the portrayals in them are not accurate. There are lots of discrepancies in the Gospels, and they really matter. There are discrepancies about how Jesus was born, about how he lived, about how he died, and how he got raised from the dead. If the Gospels can't agree on the basics, how can we accept them as reliable? The New Testament Gospels may be great books of literary and religious significance, but they're not historically reliable. Let me end where Craig began. Craig started naming scholars who supported his particular point of view, and I pointed out that, in fact, none of these scholars sees the Gospels as historically accurate. So far as I know, there is no scholar teaching in any major research university in North America who would say that, taken as they're presented to us, that the Gospels are historically accurate. Everybody would agree that this or that piece of information might be historically accurate, but read as a whole, they're inaccurate up and down the line. This is the view of every scholar that I know about in North America. The Gospels are valuable to Christians for religious reasons, but they are not historically accurate portrayals of Jesus. Thank you very much.